Putin.
Vladimir Putin. 17 years and the most powerful man in the world.
To understand how one man could have such a powerful influence on this country.
Vladimir Putin grew up in the aftermath of the Second World War. In 1945, the US, the UK and the Soviet Union met to shape the new world. 7 years on, he was born in what was then Leningrad and is now St. Petersburg. By the 70s, Putin had studied law and then joined the Russian Secret Service, the KGB. At this time, the Soviet Union's influence reached across the communist nations of Eastern Europe. And in the 80s, Putin was posted to Dresden in East Germany. From there, he witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism. This was a visceral example of people power. To Putin, though, the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. And while that demise was negotiated, Putin was heading home to find a place for himself in the new Russia. Russia's president in the 90s, Boris Yeltsin, would help him do that. He made Putin head of the security services. Then Putin was elected prime minister. Then, in 1999, Yeltsin resigned. Putin was president. And his way of operating was clear from the start.
Let's talk about Russia's president, Vladimir Putin. His decision to invade Ukraine has got a lot of people trying to figure out what's going through his mind, why he did what he did, and what he might do next. It's impossible to know for sure, but if we look back at his life and career, it can help us connect some of the dots.
Vladimir Putin has been ruling Russia since 1999. In that time, he shaped the country into an authoritarian and militaristic society. He successfully invaded two of Russia's neighbors and strengthened ties with Syria and Iran. He's intent on pushing back against the Western world order, and it appears to be working.
For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul. I wouldn't have invited him to my ranch if I didn't trust him.
The part that Russia has played in the international community since the 11th of September has been remarkable. I mean, we have cooperation today that would have been really unthinkable just a short time ago.
Der sehr freundschaftlichen Zusammenarbeit zwischen Russland und Deutschland, die vermutlich nie so gut war, wie sie jetzt ist Vertrauen.
I am confident that this new level of cooperation between NATO's members and Russia will now change the world and for the better.
Поэтому предлагаю с этого момента штаб-квартиру НАТО переименовать в Дом Советов. Думаю, что это неплохое предложение.
I will declare that to be a joke.
Do I trust him? Yeah, I trust him.
Russian heavy guns were firing at Georgian positions inside Georgia.
Buildings are burning from the last airstrike, and people are warning that the Russian Air Force may soon be back.
I brought with me today a big delegation of British business, all with an interest in expanding their trade with Russia.
We seek a significant and sensible approach to economic development across our continent, and to that end will now be closely interconnected for decades to come.
J'ai trouvé un homme très au fait de ses dossiers, très calme, très intelligent.
I'm aware of the extraordinary work that you've done on behalf of the Russian people.
Breaking news from Ukraine. Overnight, armed men seized control of two government buildings as Putin announces he's sending troops.
Many of Putin's critics have mysteriously become ill or died.
Apparent vicious political assassination of one of President Vladimir Putin's most outspoken critics.
A new report about Russian interference in the presidential election. Next, a look at how strong the evidence is that points to the Putin government.
Former Russian spy is in a critical condition in hospital.
Investigators suspect the Kremlin could be behind the incident in Salisbury on Sunday.
He says great things about me. I'm going to say great things about him. He's been a leader far more than our president has been a leader.
Wouldn't it be great if we actually got along with Russia? Am I wrong in saying that? Wouldn't it be great?
I believe that President Putin really feels, and he feels strongly, that he did not meddle in our election. He's not going into Ukraine, okay? Just so you understand. He's not going to go into Ukraine.
клянусь при осуществлении полномочий президента Российской Федерации уважать и охранять права и свободы человека и гражданина, соблюдать и защищать Конституцию Российской Федерации, защищать суверенитет и независимость, безопасность и целостность государства, верно служить народу. Победы! Ура!
Gerade diese Wahl erweiterte mehrfach die Grenzen des europäischen Humanismus und lässt uns behaupten, dass niemand und nie Russland in die Vergangenheit umwenden kann.
Возможности вновь выступить в этой представительной аудитории. Но прежде всего хотел бы пожелать 58-й сессии Генеральной Ассамблеи ООН. Спасибо большое, уважаемая госпожа федеральный канцлер, господин Тельчик, дамы и господа. Весьма признателен за приглашение на столь представительную конференцию, собравшую политиков, военных, предпринимателей, экспертов из более чем 40 стран мира.
Благодарю вас и весь личный состав Вооруженных сил России за службу.
Found my thrill on Blueberry Hill, on Blueberry Hill. When I found you, the moon stood still on Blueberry Hill and lingered until my dreams came true.
During the post-Soviet chaos, there was escalating violence in Chechnya, a region that had informally seceded from Russia in the mid-90s. Chechen warlords and terrorists were pushing into Russian territory and attacking the border. In August 1999, a series of deadly bombings killed more than 300 people in several Russian cities, including Moscow. Putin, the new prime minister, immediately blames Chechen separatists for the attacks. He regularly appears on Russian television, claiming he will avenge Russia. The population quickly rallies around him. Putin's approval ratings jump from 2% before the bombings to 45% after the bombings. Journalists later uncovered evidence that suggests Russian security services could have been complicit in the Moscow bombings, perhaps knowing they would spark support for a strong man like Putin. But a closed state investigation quickly quashed any dissenting theories. So Russia launches a popular and devastating war in Chechnya. The capital city of Grozny was leveled by Russian bombing, and some estimate close to 80,000 people died. And in less than a year, Russia successfully brings Chechnya back under its control. In December 1999, Yeltsin suddenly resigns, making Putin the interim president. In May, during the bloody campaign in Chechnya, Putin wins the presidential election. He begins to shape the Russian state to his vision. Patronage and corruption remain some of his key tools, but he quickly suppresses the oligarchs under his rule. Those that support Putin are rewarded, those that don't are eliminated.
The problem for Putin is that many of those former Soviet countries, especially in Eastern Europe, don't share his dream. Many have been much keener on joining Western clubs like the EU and NATO, and Putin sees that as a threat to Russia and his mission.
В этой связи мы ясно и четко дали понять, что дальнейшее движение НАТО на восток неприемлемо. Ну чего здесь непонятного? Мы что ли ставим ракеты рядом с границами Соединенных Штатов? Нет.
His view is that the West is just going too far, and that became obvious around 2004 with the color revolutions. These were popular uprisings across the former Soviet space, in places like Ukraine and Georgia.
All of a sudden, the Kremlin was seeing the hand of the West trying to change the governments, and that became quite threatening for the Russian government.
The first bell was ringing at the famous Munich conference in 2007, when this turn to confrontation started quite obviously and visibly.
Отдельные нормы, да по сути чуть ли не вся система права одного государства, прежде всего, конечно, Соединенных Штатов, перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах, и в экономике, и в политике.
Putin found ways to reassert Russia's power, and we saw that in the Kremlin's decisions to invade former Soviet territories, like Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, when Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, and in Ukraine again this year. These moves seem to have been pretty popular among Russians, especially the annexation of Crimea.
Crimea added a strong sort of legitimacy to this rhetoric and proved in a way that Russia is strong. They saw in him a very powerful leader who promotes Russian interests abroad, who in a way crafts a sense of belonging to Russia in a very positive way, so that people are not ashamed anymore. They were very ashamed in the 1990s with all the losses. And
Putin still appears to be popular. His invasion of Ukraine in February seems to have helped too. A recent poll put support for Putin at 83%. At the end of last year, it was in the 60s. But polls are tricky in Russia, and plenty of people question those numbers. That's because after more than 20 years in power, Putin's established a system of almost total control.
В любом случае, введение каких-то войск в прямое соприкосновение, в прямое столкновение с российской армией, это очень опасный шаг, который может привести к глобальной катастрофе. Надеюсь, что ума, разума у тех, кто говорит об этом, хватит для того, чтобы подобных опасных шагов не предпринимать. Они должны сами определить, что для них важнее: выполнение каких-то союзнических обязательств, так как они это видят, или обеспечение интересов своего собственного народа, своих национальных интересов. Но, судя по тому, что вы сказали, во главу угла в данном случае, судя по всему, поставлены союзнические какие-то обязательства, в данном случае Федеративной Республики, в рамках Североатлантического альянса. Правильно это или нет, я считаю, что это ошибка, и за эту ошибку расплачиваются бизнес, экономика, граждане Федеративной Республики. Ну, с ее интересами, судя по всему, мало кто считается, иначе не подрывали бы Северный поток-1 и Северный поток-2. Они хоть и не работали, но это была такая, как бы, был такой элемент надежности, что в крайнем случае их можно было бы включить. Но теперь такой возможности нет. Хотя там одна ветка, как я говорил, в Москве, все-таки, видимо, в рабочем состоянии, но и решение не принимается, судя по всему, вряд ли будет принято, но это уже не наше дело, это дело наших партнеров. Мы не ставили перед собой задачу уничтожения Украины. Нет, конечно. Все хорошо.
As the war in Ukraine rages back into the capital city for the first time since June, more talk of nuclear threats and no sign of peace on the horizon. At a conference in Kazakhstan, the Russian president telling reporters there's, quote, no need for talks with the American president. While Putin ally and president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, sat with my colleague Keir Simmons for an exclusive interview and a warning.
If you drive a person or a country into a corner, there's only one way out from there. That is to move forward. That is why red lines should not be crossed. You just shouldn't cross them.
That red line, he says, an attack on Russian soil.
Russia has clearly outlined its position. If there is to be, God forbid, an attack on the territory of the Russian Federation, in that case, Russia can, if necessary, use all kinds of weapons.
Here in the Ukrainian capital, after repeated threats from Moscow, many fear nuclear weapons could be used at any time.
We can't do anything about the nuclear war, but we can live our lives as we want. We don't want to be afraid, we just want to live happy.
You have to be ready just in case, but you have to live your life and go on like it's usual.
For Ukraine, it's not just the threat of nuclear weapons, the government accusing Russia of nuclear terrorism, occupying the largest nuclear power plant in Europe and torturing the Ukrainian staff.
It's very hard for them to operate the plant in these conditions because they're actually periodically captured, tortured and beaten.
So the Russians are torturing the workers of the plant?
Yeah, they just from time to time.
Another threat hanging over a country taking stock after a week of overwhelming airstrikes.
Putin, the rules are for him to make. He said as much himself.
I hope no one will cross Russia's red line, but in each case we are the ones who will decide where the red line is.
And Russia's right to decide roots back to Putin's view of what he's seen in his lifetime. In 2015, he addressed the UN and said, instead of the triumph of democracy and progress, we got violence, poverty and social disaster. Nobody cares a bit about human rights. Putin's contempt was directed at Western democracy. We've seen, though, how little he cares for democracy in Russia and Ukraine. Despite this, years earlier, the West talked of trusting him.
I'll answer the question. I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward. I was able to get a sense of his soul.
We're getting a sense of it too this week, as we did a few years ago when Putin spoke of his childhood, telling us, 50 years ago, the Leningrad street taught me a rule. If a fight is inevitable, you have to throw the first punch. There was nothing inevitable about this week, but Ukraine has felt that first punch. A punch Putin justifies in his country's interests, but which very much serve his. And as we've watched the violence, I think back to that criticism of the West at the UN in 2015. Putin said, I'm urged to ask those who created this situation, do you at least realize now what you've done? The world is now asking the same of him, and everything about Putin's life suggests, yes, he does realize what he's done.